Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk about putting a lifeline in, and then a lifeline for a project you are knitting in the round. In another video on this channel you see how to put it with an average piece of scrap yarn and then with a project you are knitting back and forth, so actually a flat panel. When do you use such a lifeline? Such a lifeline you can use when you come to a part in your project that is new to you and of which you are not quite sure whether that is the right thing to do for your project. And this lifeline makes it easier to put the stitches back on the loom, so it's actually back on it as it is now. In this video you'll see me doing it with a piece of scrap yarn, but you can also do it with a circular needle and put that cable of the circular needle actually behind the pegs. In the video of the flat panel you see me showing it with a sewing needle, but you can also do it with your hook. So the example is a sock, and with this sock I want to try a certain way of casting off to see if it fits. You take a piece of scrap yarn that is at least 1.5 times as long as the project. The piece where you put the stitches on is a bit shorter, so it saves a lot of looping. And or you grab the scrap yarn from above, so from the top of the stitch, and you loop it through, or from the bottom and you loop it through. You can also see that the stitches are positioned on the scrap yarn in a different way. And why say from below or from above? So they will be on the scrap yarn in the same direction, and then it will be easier when you put it back on the loom. And convenient as well is always start with stitch 1 and end with your last stitch. Then you also know from where you have to put it back on. Also useful is a small piece of yarn to mark your project. Then you also know from where you have to put it back. And this is your wrong side, so actually the side you're looking at when the project is on your loom. It could be that you fit your project, your sock, and then accidentally pull it inside out. And then you put it also back inside out on the loom again. And then your wrong side becomes your right side and your right side becomes your wrong side. So then you put that little piece of yarn like this and you move on. What also is useful in this case, look, now I put the scrap yarn in front of the pegs, is that this scrap yarn that you put it behind the pegs. Why is that? That's to prevent you from knitting your scrap yarn, and then it's more difficult to pull it out. So you put the piece of scrap yarn, and of course you can do that after you have looped through all the stitches, or you just do it at the same time that you are putting the stitches on. Or you do it right away, you loop through and you take the scrap yarn right behind the peg and use the way that is most convenient for you. That's the fun part of knitting. There are several ways that lead to Rome. So you loop and you adjust. At a certain point that loop will become too short, and then you will try to pull it through. Because you have a smaller stitch here and the U-wrap, it's a bit more difficult. Then you go halfway through the scrap yarn a little, so you have enough space again to continue looping, and then you pull at it very gently. So you loop your scrap yarn and you pull at it nice and gently. And that's what you do with all the stitches. You put them on the piece of scrap yarn, you loop or put the scrap yarn behind it, you adjust, you pull on or pull at it, and yes, during knitting you can also do the same, of course. You check and in the meantime you check whether all stitches are properly on the scrap yarn, so that the lifeline, for example, is not somewhere in front of a peg. But when you continue knitting and you see a piece of the scrap yarn in front of it somewhere, you can always move it back to the back of the peg. And this is your last stitch, and then you try to get those ends of the scrap yarn a little even, and then you are ready for your technique or your new technique. Well, you have fitted it and you have discovered it's not the way I want it to be. Then you are going to check before you put it back on the loom. Is my scrap yarn, which I use to mark on the inside, is that on the right spot? You can also see here that my skein has gone through the sock, and you put it back the right way. You check it out. I'm going to take that casting off edge off as well. I had secured the stitch for a while, and this is actually your last stitch on the loom as well. So actually an extra checkpoint. Multiple ways to check. In case of an odd loom, you can see your first and last stitch here, because there are always two of the same stitches knitted with a rib stitch. You very gently frog until you see that the stitches are going through the scrap yarn. Very gently. You see a stitch there, and that's an only stitch. And here you see those two. Those are your first and last stitch. This one you give a little bit of extra attention because it goes back on the loom first. It sometimes happens with putting a lifeline that you missed one. So this is my first peg, and you put back the stitch on it. Here's the stitch inserted in the scrap yarn, and then you can use the scrap yarn to put the stitches back on. Then you actually use that little piece of scrap yarn as a kind of leverage. You can also use your hook to put the stitches back on. Have you done a knee wrap with your project? Then you put the stitch back on twisted. Have you done a U-wrap as a knit stitch? Then of course you watch carefully that you don't put the stitch back on twisted. You loop your scrap yarn so that it becomes manageable to put the stitches back on, and then you put the stitches back with your hook, and then you see if it ain't twisted. Or you loop your scrap yarn between stitch 1 and stitch 2, and you use your scrap yarn to put the stitch back on, and then you can possibly use the ridge behind the stitch that you open with your nail, for example. At a certain moment you will notice this way I put the stitch back, and then actually you know to use, you know which movement to use to put the stitches back on, and then it's much easier to put the stitches back on. A stitch like the U-wrap, and you've pulled it in the length when you were fitting it, then you will notice it's a bit slimmer than a loom, and then you correct it by pulling at it a little bit, and you pull your knitting project towards the loom so it goes back into the width. Look, you use the scrap yarn to open the stitch, and you put it on the loom. Repeat this, and one stitch will be easier than the other, but search for an easy way for yourself to put the stitches back on. And when you put the rib stitch back, there's of course something else you have to pay attention to, and that is that you just put the rib stitch back the right way. How can you tell? Look, these were my pearls, and you can recognize a pearl stitch by the V shape and the spot where you have put a marker on. And the knit stitch you can recognize because there's a ridge. So you put the V shape back on the back with a marker, and the knit stitch, the one with the ridge, that you put back on the back without a marker. At least my loom was marked in such a way that the purl stitch was knitted on the back with a marker. If you only use a knit stitch, it doesn't matter, but with a rib stitch, and I would put the rib back on the marker and the knit stitch back on the back with the marker, then I continue where I knitted a knit stitch in purl stitch, and you will see that for sure. As you reach the end, you also notice that it's getting tighter and tighter, and you can also use the tension or elasticity of your project to pull it towards the loom, which makes it easier to put the project back on the pegs. Also make sure you put both strands back when you have knitted a project with multiple strands. And yes, there are all kinds of little tricks and tools you can use to put such a project back on the loom. Look here, for example, you pull, you open the stitch a little with your nail, or you use the ridge behind the knit stitch to open it. You can also use the back to open the stitch. And you loop the scrap yarn and just look for a way that is convenient for you to put it back. You loop the scrap yarn again, and of course you can also use your hook to put the stitches back on. All means are allowed. And at a certain point you will notice that you have reached your last stitches, and here you pay attention. You don't want to loop them through enormously, because this is your last stitch. That's where the skein is. We don't want to see any tension difference. And then after putting the last stitch on without pulling at it too hard, you are going to check. You check if there is about the same tension on your knitting project everywhere. If that ain't the case, you can also knit one row backwards again, and then you knit the row anew, so that your project has the same tension again over there. Well, lifeline lesson. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time. Bye bye.